Okay, so what is your opinion on this, actually? I'm really interested to know, because we've never talked about the whole morality question with regards to religion. Do you first of all, do you think that atheists can be good without God, or are we all bad people?
I definitely think that the answer is yes, that you can be good without God. I don't think that Christians necessarily get their morality because it's been revealed. I think that God himself tells us that he writes morality on our hearts. He writes the morality on all people's hearts, that we're responsible to our conscience, for example, that we're all given that. And so I think another important point with morality is like, what's the basis for it? Like, where does it come from? We believe that morality is based in the nature of God himself, and that without, like, if God didn't exist, then morality is just socio-cultural relativism. So,
okay, that's really interesting, because I think maybe that might be a point where we would differ. In that I don't see how, and actually this is a discussion that I was having yesterday with Armin as well, which is that I don't see how it makes a difference whether God exists or not for things to be moral or immoral. And the reason why is because it seems to me that the best that God could do is to articulate or give the reasons for things being wrong, so that they were in terms of like harming people or violating people's volition, consent. Sorry. Do you know what I mean? Like, God would have to explain why his commandments were good or why his prohibitions were bad in a way that would be understandable to human beings. And ultimately, it's those reasons that makes his commandments or his prohibitions good or bad, not the nature of God. So I guess, yeah, that's what do you think about that?
I don't think that you need God to, like, you're saying that you don't need God to exist because he doesn't explain the reasons for it? Is that what?
No, because if, let's take a specific commandment to not steal. Okay. So let's say so God has a reason why he commanded that, right?
Right.
And it seems to me the reason why he commanded that isn't to do with his nature, but is to do with a fact about human beings, which is that it's wrong to harm another person.
Okay.
Or a sentient being even. And stealing is a kind of harm because we have social conventions of ownership. So we recognize certain things as belonging to other people,
right,
and taking from them harms them somehow.
Right, and so I think what you're trying to say is like, we already observe that harming other human beings is wrong. Like the humanist can see this, that it's wrong to hurt other humans. But what I'm saying is before humanity, right, God already wrote these moral laws on our very being. So that's why the humanist and the atheist and anybody, that's why anybody can see that it's wrong to harm other people, to steal other people, is because God's already provided the objective platform for those morals. And that if God doesn't exist and these are just something that we discover, then it's just our opinion. And that you can say that all morality, all moral questions just end up in the argument of says who, right? If you say, hey, it's wrong to steal, says who, right? Who are you to say what's wrong for me to do? Who are you to say with this culture, like if there's a culture that actually highly prizes stealing, right? Who are we to say that what they're doing is wrong? And as a Christian, I can say that the reason I can tell another culture that what they're doing is wrong is because there's a moral law that's written on the hearts of all people, and it's based in the nature of God himself. Like that's what I can appeal to. Because without that objective basis, then you're just in socio-cultural relativism. How can you tell the South African that apartheid is wrong? You know, or that he's not just struggling to survive against competing races, right? like it's hard to tell them that if a whole culture is accepting that.
Well, in fairness, South Africa has gotten rid of apartheid now.
Yeah, I know, but how can we say that it's wrong?
Right.
Right.
Well, okay, you made a lot of points there.
Yeah.
Let me see, where do I... So...
I was mainly saying we have an objective basis in God.
Yeah.
And that's also why we can not just accept...
okay, so I wanted to say, actually, it seems like Christians would also recognize a certain degree of relativism, just like all people do, that what is right or wrong does depend to a certain extent on the time and the place. It's not... and the people under consideration.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's true.
So we would agree that's a common ground there.
Yeah.
That it's not completely absolute. Morality it does depend on human nature, it does depend on
there's definitely a big aspect of that. I would say that there's just certain core morals.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So but the thing is, I can say the same thing based on the fact that we are all human beings, or we are all animals. Or all mammals, at least, because not all animals share the same properties, but at least all mammals have certain capacities for suffering. I shouldn't just say mammals, because that's kind of... Anyway, the characteristics about human beings that makes harming one another bad is shared by other animals as well. And it seems to me it's those characteristics that you say were written or recognizing the violation of those characteristics is written on our hearts. I could say the same thing. I can say that there is a universal moral code that if all human beings communicated with one another about how best to live together, we would eventually arrive at some harmonized view.
On utilitarianism?
No, not necessarily utilitarianism.
Okay.
It could be any given... so utilitarianism is just one way of communicating right and wrong.
Okay.
There's also a lot of other frameworks. And in philosophy, we argue with one another about what's the best framework.
Right.
Without necessarily saying this is what God has decreed.
Okay. Well, I'll say one thing. I would take an issue with all mammals.
Okay.
Because I just think that animals, while we can apprehend some moral behavior in them, I don't think that animals are necessarily moral beings.
I would agree.
Because when a lion kills a gazelle, it doesn't murder it, right? It just simply kills it, right? Or when we see rape in the animal kingdom, right? We don't say that it's just... When in animals, we wouldn't say that that's wrong, but in humans, this is a moral abomination, right? And so I think that there's a separate morality that's just for humans, that we don't share with mammals.
Well, I should be clear. What I meant was that the characteristics of human beings that makes it wrong for us to hurt one another are shared by animals, so that it's wrong to hurt animals as well. That's what I'm claiming. I'm not claiming that animals participate in moral reasoning or recognizing the wrongness of murder or rape or anything like that. I obviously completely agree with you that they don't. What I'm saying is that they also suffer, and that the reason why harming people is wrong doesn't have anything to do with the nature of God, but even if it did have to do with the nature of God, if God didn't exist, it would still be wrong for the same reasons that it's wrong if God does exist. So I actually don't think that God makes a difference in this regard.
Okay, well, I would say I wouldn't agree with that because, for example, let's take the Holocaust, for example, right? So there's many reasons that the Germans could have tried to justify their position, right? But no matter what they say, right? Even if the Germans were to have won World War II and actually taken over the entire world, and this became a part of their history, that this is what they did, we would still say that what they're doing is wrong. Even if it ended up the whole majority of the world began to agree with their position, we would still justifiably say what they did was wrong, because God has an objective morality that says it's wrong, and we can say says God. But if the Germans had won World War II and people were to still cry out and say what you did was wrong, they would say says who, right?
Well, the beautiful thing is we can actually run this social experiment, and we have. There actually is a society, and there are many societies that are founded in a genocidal history, and they did win their respective revolutions or battles, and they went on to recognize the inhumanity of their former ways. And they don't actually all agree that it was totally fine and it was just says who. They don't. So what I'm saying is actually that's not how human beings function. And that even the Germans are the most sensitive to the atrocities. I shouldn't say that they're the most sensitive, but they are the most ashamed of the atrocities that were committed by the Nazi regime.
Right.
So that even denying the Holocaust in Germany is illegal. Right. And it's a federal offense that you go to jail for, mandatory jail time, where this is like unheard of anywhere else in the world. The German people, once they recognized what was happening behind the walls of the concentration camps, were horrified. And they would have been, what I'm claiming is they would have been horrified just as much had Germany won World War II and succeeded in creating a United States of Europe. It's not the case that the reason why the Nazi soldiers were able to carry out the atrocities of World War II is because it's a result of a series of dehumanizing methods that they implemented. Well, so I guess what do you think about that claim that it's not true that human beings would just believe in anything?
Well, I actually agree with what you said. I agree, but I'm talking about the objective reasoning for that. The reason that I think that Germans today see what they did was wrong. The reason that cultures that might have been big on genocide, they will eventually see what they're doing is wrong, is because there's moral absolutes that are based in the character of God himself. Because that's like when we started this, I said that atheists and anybody can be good without God because God has already written a moral code in their hearts. But when we talk about what's moral and what's not moral, the reason I'll appeal to God, before the Holocaust happens, right? There was many pastors who stood up and said what you're doing is wrong because of God, right? But the way that, from the other end, the way that it can be justified is it's socio-cultural relativism. What they have, their own needs at the time that they think that are big and more important than these morals, and so they choose to flaunt the morality of the day and change things up, right? And we see this all the time in people who decide to disregard the morality of the day, and it's just because they've made these socio-cultural decisions, right?
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm confused about is how God changes anything, because the nature of human beings stays the same, and the writtenness of the moral code stays the same if there is no God, so that there is still a universal moral law, even if there is no God.
So you do believe in moral absolutes?
I'm not sure what you mean by moral absolutes.
That there's an example for murder. That murder would be an absolute. It's absolutely wrong to murder other people, and this would be a timeless moral absolute.
Yeah.
So you do accept that moral absolutes exist?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by exist. I think that's also another.
Well, I think your position is that you're saying moral absolutes do exist, and they exist, and they're grounded in human experience.
Okay, I like that.
Okay. And I would just say that, then what do you say to the person who chooses to disregard that?
Well, there may be nothing that you can say to them if they're a psychopath, for example. But if they're not a psychopath, then I would appeal to their empathic sensibilities.
What makes the social morals of the day any different than the social fashion sense? Like, for example, we have kind of a social fashion sense, and then Lady Gaga comes along, right? And looks very different and sometimes can even be offensive to people, right? And so she's just flaunting the herd fashion sense, right? But then we also get people that come up and flaunt the herd morality. Like, if it's just fashion or morality, what's the real difference? Like, what makes one thing more important than another?
I would say that it's empathy that makes one thing more important than the other.
And why is empathy important?
Well, it's what connects us with one another. I mean, if somebody doesn't feel empathy, then trying to convince them that a certain behavior is wrong or right in terms of, look, don't you see it's harming people, is just the same as asking someone who's blind to recognize that a building is taller than another building. They actually lack a faculty of perception.
Why should anybody feel empathy?
That's like saying, how do I justify the difference in height of two buildings to somebody that's not, that has no eyes? The should language already presupposes that we have empathy.
Yeah, you're appealing to moral absolutes. Like, you're saying that there's already an absolute there. One building is taller than another one, and anybody who denies it is simply wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And we all experience that empathy is very important, and it's something that we should all feel. And anybody who says that we don't need to, they're simply wrong. I would say the reason that we can say that is because God has put these moral absolutes on our hearts. But if we're talking about human experience, and there's a person who says it's beneficial to me and my family and even my culture and however much more you want to take, however broader you want to take it, for me not to feel this empathy towards this person at this one time, who's to say that's wrong?
Well, but this is what I'm saying is that sort of question is like asking a scientist to justify science with scientifically prove that science is reliable. So you actually have to presuppose that should language is important to even be part of the conversation of why should we care about one another. So if somebody isn't in that presupposition,
right,
they aren't even part of the conversation. And if somebody is in that presupposition where they agree that shoulds are important things, then that is an irrelevant question to them because they're already committed to it. Okay. So it's kind of it seems like a nonsense question to me. It's like, if somebody is even willing to listen to why they should care about other people, then they already do care about other people. And if somebody isn't willing to listen to why they should care, then there's nothing, none of this talk about God is going to get psychopaths to care, for example. Right.
So we agree that moral absolutes do exist. We just disagree on their
metaphysical grounding. Yeah.
And so on the psychopath who decides to forget about morality, your response to him would be that he's wrong just because we don't agree with you?
No, I don't have any response to him. There's not necessarily any way of bringing a psychopath into a pro-social relationship with the rest of society.
Okay.
And I recognize that that's unfortunately a limitation of human beings.
How about this? How do you reason with a culture that says we can achieve peace and flourishing, but you just have to break a few eggs? Like, we have to take out 40 million people to accomplish our goals. How do you reason with a culture that says that?
Well, that's very difficult. I mean, the Christian culture says that kind of thing sometimes. But that is not a question that I think is made any easier by introducing the existence of God. Do you disagree?
No, I don't. I don't disagree. That's not what I was trying to say there. Like, I'm trying to say their human experience is different, and through their human experience, they've come to make this decision that breaking a few eggs for a better culture is what's right for their culture. And that's because that comes out of their human experience.
Okay, well,
I would say from my point of view that the nature of God is changeless. And so that I'm sorry that whatever you've come to decide is wrong. And when they say, who are you to say this? I would say that, well, God has written these moral codes on all of our hearts.
Well,
you would say, well, my human experience is just different than your human experience.
No.
And so it's...
What I would say is that if they put themselves in the place of the people who they are trampling to achieve their goals, this is the whole does the end justify the means question. Is it justified to kill one person and cut them up and take their organs to save the lives of 12 people, right? Their heart goes to this person, Sally, that needs a heart.
Okay.
Their liver goes to Bob, who needs a liver. And the reason why we don't want to do that isn't just because it's my personal human experience that's bad.
Okay.
It's because we can imagine what it would be like to be in the position of the one who's being cut up. And that, again, comes down to empathy. So this is what John Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. John Rawls is a famous social philosopher. And if we can put ourselves behind this veil of ignorance so that we ignore sociocultural differences, then we can recognize what behaviors are fair and unfair. Because those behaviors that privilege one group of people arbitrarily and disadvantage another group of people arbitrarily just because of their socioeconomic status, those can't be fair maxims or principles.
I think that you have some presuppositions there,
though,
right? Like, you're saying that you have a presupposition that all people should be treated equally, right? When this has not been true in history, that there's many people like, it's Plato, right, who thought that he kind of started teaching about morals, but he had no problem with like sometimes up to 50% of the population being slaves, right? And so that like that certain things were for the rich and the ruling class, and certain things were for other people, right?
It's Aristotle.
So there are certain people who, so throughout history, who have not observed this, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of presupposing that all people should be treated equal, that all people should put themselves into the position of the person being taken advantage of. So, and I want to say that I think that you're getting that because God has written these codes on people's hearts, because people who have chosen to flaunt it, right? They said it doesn't matter. I feel this, because I think that they probably did feel that. Like when people abused slaves, they probably did feel these things, but then their own justifications for that took precedent.
I don't think that I'm presupposing that.
Okay.
I think I'm putting an argument forward for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the culture that we live in that takes that for granted, mm-hmm. that we should put ourselves in the position of other people so that we can try to figure out what behavior is fair and unfair, is a consequence of all of the Enlightenment thinkers who challenged the previous moral structure that justified stratifications of society and inequality, and like, for example, when Rousseau says that might does not make right, that's not something that's obvious to human beings. We have to actually reason ourselves into recognizing these principles.
Right, but I think, I don't know, I think you're making my point there. I think what you're saying is like, we had certain morals, but then we had Enlightenment thinkers who started to challenge these ways of being, and then morals changed.
Yeah.
Right? And then I think that's very true, because people think very differently today than they did 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. We think different, our morals change. But that's relativism. That somebody's come along and just changed the way people think.
Well, it's not necessarily that I'm claiming we were right in the past, and every point in history has always been right, and we will be right in the future, whatever we think. It's just like how in the past we had pre-Newtonian physics, where we didn't understand the difference between acceleration and velocity and all this stuff. And then we had Newtonian physics that gave us a much more coherent model of how kinematics works. And now we have Einsteinian and quantum mechanical physics. And nobody would say, oh, that's just physical relativism, man. Like, you think that Newton was just as right as Einstein, and like, it's just all your opinion. No, we're slowly, very slowly discovering and reasoning about how the world works, how nature behaves, and articulating that to one another.
I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that, because I mean, a lot of people who would say that moral absolutes in this way don't exist, and that it is just relativism.
Right.
This is an atheist point of view that I encounter quite a bit.
Right.
So I actually really appreciate that you believe that moral absolutes do exist, and that they are as evident as some physical laws. So,
which I don't think are that evident.
So, well, just your example of the buildings, for example.
Right.
One is taller than the other one. And so that, for example, like I'm trying to remember that Russell quote that's like, my distaste of genocide is similar to my distaste of
ice cream or something
like that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people would say something along those lines. And so, but I think that your position is, you're saying, no, the guy who says that it's the same as ice cream is just as wrong as the guy who says this building is taller than that building.
Yeah. And I think that I think that the way that morality works is basically we have first glance intuitions about how things should be, and then we have frameworks for understanding those intuitions, and we go back and forth between them. Like, for example, an intuition that I think that we have that is wrong because of a greater understanding is that if you explain to people that thousands of people in the Sudan are being denied their human rights, they actually have a harder time relating to that than if you say this one person is having difficulty with achieving drinking, or like getting drinking water.
Yeah, we see that every day on social media, for example, right?
Yeah. But so this is where our human intuition actually is not serving us, and we have to subject our intuition to a moral framework to be able to recognize where it's not working. So it's not. I'm not saying that whatever we perceive at first glance is always right, but it's a starting point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I actually really appreciate your point of view. I disagree with the basis of it, but I think it's quite close to the Christian viewpoint.
Yeah.
So
I agree.